Hi, good evening and welcome to the law series during the COVID-19 lockdowns. Today we look at a very interesting topic at length, which is known as e-commerce and laws pertaining to e-commerce. The interesting characteristic about the laws is that it always legislates in response to events. In other words, the law is always behind events that are taking place in any particular country. Laws do not jump the gun and legislate in preparation for events that may take place. But in relation to e-commerce laws, we see a totally different situation. The laws pertaining to e-commerce were actually created in Malaysia or legislated in Malaysia way back, even 15 years ago. But in a strange way, the laws seem to be ahead of its time. Most people paid scant attention to these laws. Firstly, they didn't. There was a problem with enforcement of these laws, especially those relating to cybercrime, computer crimes, etc. And when these laws were passed at that time, and when they created the multimedia super corridor, most people could not quite comprehend or even appreciate these advances or this legislation. But imagine in just a few weeks when this virus struck, suddenly we begin to look at these laws which were in place 15 years ago, and now we realize the value of this legislation, that someone had the foresight to put these laws and create these laws so that with this current health situation, we are not, the law is not behind the events. In fact, it has sort of preempted these events, and these laws now become very important, especially now with the effect of the virus having on the economy and employment. More people need to use websites, and more people need to turn to e-commerce. In the old days, we used to have a handshake to seal a deal, and we use paper and pen to sign agreements. But now, with the social distancing, the scenario seems to have changed. We need to go into a touchless economy. Touchless now becomes premium. So it's like the world has turned upside down, and suddenly we are faced with a new situation. For example, to maintain distribution channels, many traditional businesses may now need to look at developing or creating their own websites. So that's why e-commerce is a very interesting aspect of the law and laws relating to e-commerce, because suddenly we are now in the dark and we need a light to show the way out of this current darkness. How do we keep the economy running? How do we keep contractual obligations binding with the minimum of physical contact, or in fact no physical contact at all? It is an understatement to say that laws develop behind the state of reality. Even with the flexibility of the common law, the law still develops in response to changing needs of society. Indeed, even though the common law allows judges a limited role in the good order of the legal system and to adhere to a principle based on the rule of law, this presupposes two major assumptions. First, that judges are well equipped to respond to the modern needs of society, and second, that the incremental lawmaking approach does allow for sufficient flexibility in order for the judge to make his decision. However, subscribing to a theory of better late than never, many legal systems have opted for copious amounts of legislation to address societal developments. There are, however, many things that the legislation cannot cover fully or is unable to do so because the legislation itself is too rigorous or inflexible. The belatedness and inadequacy of legislation has been identified as the lack of legislation. While the world legal systems may have had the luxury of time in the age of industrial revolution, the age of information technology has careened down the path of developments at the same speed at which information packets speed through the internet. Terms such as internet speed and connectivity have revolutionized our lives such that anyone waking up now from a 20-year-old coma would hardly recognize the world we live in. In order to facilitate and bring legal certainty to e-commerce transaction, legislators in Malaysia, as far back as 15 years ago, remember, have seen fit to introduce legislation such as the Digital Signature Act 1997, the Computer Crimes Act 1997, and the Optical Disc Act 2000. In certain areas, Malaysia has opted to maintain the status quo, allowing for existing legislation and common law to govern areas of e-commerce. These allowed for familiarity to breed alongside innovation. However, the specific and contemporary threat to crimes committed against computers necessitated the passing of the Computer Crimes Act 1997. The crimes covered under this act are unauthorized access to computer material, authorized access with intent to commit or facilitate commission of further offences, unauthorized modification of the contents of any computer, and wrongful communication. Now, some of these laws, even the Computer Crimes Act of Malaysia, because there have been new developments, and this act was passed in 1987, they may be in need of a substantial overhaul, but we'll look at this later. The expanded scope of intellectual property requiring protection on the internet call for an updating of the traditional scope of copyright protection. In the amendments to the Copyright Act 1987, the right to broadcast has been made technology neutral, and electronic rights management information is now protected. In addition to the enhancement of existing intellectual property rights, Malaysia also sought to address the growing problem of copyright piracy. One of the legislative initiatives taken to combat the piracy of copyright works in the form of optical discs and to strengthen the protection of intellectual property rights in Malaysia is the Optical Disc Act 2000. Though in fact some aspects of this law has already been overtaken by other newer technology. The act, which was made effective on 15 September 2000, provides for the licensing and regulation of the manufacture of optical discs. The legal developments coincided with the establishment of the Multimedia Super Corridor Malaysia, a government-led initiative to create a hub for info communication technology to attract investments in this area. Again, many of the developments here have been superseded in a sense that today there is really no need for a super corridor because developments in technology can happen anywhere, in any place, and is not restricted to one particular region. But nevertheless, we need to look at this because this was the genesis of the technological developments in our country. And in fact, the leaders of that time had the foresight to see into the future and provide a legislative framework. And in fact, much of this framework may now even be outdated or may not be relevant, but at least there is something to build on rather than starting from scratch. Coming back to the multimedia super corridor, with a bill of guarantees to provide a world-class physical and information infrastructure, unrestricted employment of local and foreign knowledge workers, freedom of ownership by exempting companies with MSC Malaysia status from local ownership requirements, freedom to source capital globally for MSC Malaysia infrastructure, the right to borrow funds globally, competitive financial incentives, including 10-year income tax holidays, no internet censorship, globally competitive telecommunication tariffs, and an effective one-stop agency in the Multimedia Development Corporation. MSC promised to become a regional leader in intellectual property protection and cyber laws. You see, all this that I'm going through is actually history. The history of the technological development and revolutions in Malaysia. Some of you may say, why look at all this? Because the scenario now is totally different. But it is important because history is something that it's about the past, but it gives us a vision to look and develop the future. So the MSC offered 7 flagship applications as Malaysian initiatives for the information age, namely this electronic government. Okay, now what is electronic government? The primary aim of this initiative is to create a virtually paperless administration and to encourage the widespread use of electronic and multimedia networks in the government. It is envisaged that electronic and multimedia infrastructure will be implemented at all levels of government, and consequently information flows and processes relating to government affairs will be made less cumbersome and more efficient. Now we can see some of these like in these days, if you go to the police station to make a police report on an accident, they key in the information and then there's a printout, and then there's a receipt. You pay a fine or a compound, and you go to the courthouse. A lot of things can be done electronically, and same with the Central Land Office, where you go and register a title or register a dealing, and all this is also done electronically. It can be done from the comfort of your home. Now, all this didn't just kind of take place just like that. There was a legislative framework, there were certain signposts, and when these laws were put in place, there was a guide for legislators on what needs to be done. So the interesting thing about technology laws is that unlike other laws where the laws follow events, in technology law it's the reverse. You need vision-minded people to see what will happen and draw up those laws. And sometimes when those laws are put in place, you don't see the overall impact or the big picture. But in time to come, the blanks get filled in, and then you begin to understand. So a lot of these things that we see now, the technological innovations in government, applying for payments and your tax returns and all that, did not come just like that, but they had this legislative history that we should look at. Okay, the second flagship was the multi-purpose card. The National Multi-Purpose Card application seeks to develop a single and common platform for a multi-purpose card that will enable government and private application providers to implement smart card solutions without duplications of effort and investment. The MyCard project was reported to be fully underway with over 17 million cards issued at that time, where national rollout commenced and over 90% of ATMs accepting MyCards. Although in the context of Sabah, it produced some negative effects, like a lot of false identity cards, but that's another issue. What I'm trying to illustrate here is most people look at the MyCard and think that it's just an ordinary identity card, but then there's a lot of technological input into the creation of this card. Next, the other flagship development was the Smart School. Now, this was a very interesting flagship. The initiative was part of the government's long-term plan towards IT literacy by the year 2020. Smart schools will utilize relevant courseware and technological infrastructure and adhere to a suitable curriculum and will eventually encompass the entire nation. To achieve this initiative, all smart schools will also practice a teaching-learning process of curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and teaching-learning materials, whereby students are expected to practice self-assessed and self-directed learning that places focus on long-term mental development rather than short-term academic excellence. Okay, some of these things, actually most of these things never saw fruition, but suddenly now with the need for e-learning, this now begins to sound like familiar language, and the need to implement this. So it's interesting. Way back 15 years ago, all these things were looked at, but nobody really paid attention to it. But suddenly, because of the virus and because of the pandemic, and then suddenly everybody's into e-learning, and this kind of learning through video and learning without schools. We never thought in our lifetime we have to think at the possibility of learning without schools and without classrooms. Now the next flagship application under the MSC was the telehealth. The telehealth initiative aims to keep people in the wellness paradigm through the availability of health information and virtual health services, thus transforming the way healthcare services are delivered and accessed using multimedia networks, linking all players to provide products and services in healthcare. 4 telehealth flagship applications in this pilot project are teleconsultation, mass customized or personalized health information and education, lifetime health plan, and continuing medical education. When I read this, it's like reading fiction, because like this law was passed in somewhere around 2007, and they had all these ideas, but nobody really paid much attention to it. And suddenly now when you read it, for example, we are looking at a situation where because of the economic downturn, or in fact the total damage of economy, most doctors, clinics may go out of business. Will they? Because they may need to be practitioners of telehealth. They may need to reach a wider range of patients who don't have to go to the clinic. You use your handphone, take a video of whatever you're suffering, whatever condition you're in, and then he can make an initial assessment. This is a new challenge for the doctors. Instead of sitting in the clinics and then the whole day waiting for customers, for patients, and then there's a joke. The patient come in and then just open his mouth and say and then get examined, and then the whole day the doctor has to do that. These kind of perceptions have to change now. Instead of you going to the doctor's clinic, the clinic has to come to your home. And you see all these laws like the telemedicine health. When I first read it years ago, I was so impressed. But then nothing was done. Everything was left. It's just like everything went to sleep. And suddenly now when you look at it, the new doctors have to look at taking care of patients like that. And if they can do that, then the clinic can be open 24/7 virtually. Of course, does not mean that all treatment takes place in the clinic, but the clinic can be a kind of the clinic that's virtual. So you and your family can have medical checkups through using all these new media like handphones. And if there's a suspicion that something is going more serious, then you can go and check in with the clinic. So the doctors, the way the doctors function, the way they do things will totally change. And so instead of the economy going bust, it's going to a new level and a new development. And these are the things that we need to look at and study because of what has happened as a result of the virus. The next flagship is called R&D, Research and Development Clusters. Although clusters is a kind of dirty word, but that was the word used at that time. The initiative aims to develop a structure that will facilitate research and development activities. The primary focus of such clusters will be the development of next generation multimedia technologies and human and intellectual capital. The aim is to create a conducive research environment whereby academia and industry will work together in a synergistic relationship to develop cutting-edge multimedia technologies. The transfer of technology to Malaysian startups from more developed establishments abroad will also be promoted. You see, when the pandemic strikes, everybody is looking at the old industries like the travel and the traditional industries and trying to see how to bail them out. But actually, we have to put more innovation into the newer kind of industries, or rather than the new startups. People coming up with more solutions in how to operate in this new environment of the pandemic. Not looking backwards and trying to save. No, I'm not saying that you don't save some sectors, but you don't try to just by trying to save all these traditional activities may result in us heading nowhere, when we need to emphasize on new ways of doing things, like for example, now the way you order food, the way you get your food from the restaurants and things like that, or the way you have transportation, where companies like Grab, who don't have taxis, and suddenly they have become the number one, together with Uber, the number one transport providers. So we need to develop these areas even more. It's very important, because all these years, because I was one of those who was very into tech, and I had a lot of ideas, but when I try to talk about it, nobody seems to listen, because they think that it's too far down the road. But suddenly now we have a paradigm shift. We have a total change of what's happening in the world, and this is the time when governments and agencies need to look for this kind of people. This is a time when they need to look at things like because I used to mix around with a lot of these young tech people, like Kinabalu coders and all that, and they brought me to their HQ somewhere in Bandar Berjaya, and they showed me a lot of stuff like artificial intelligence and all that, and most of the time there was no demand for this kind of stuff. It was just like things they did as a hobby, as a passion, and these were very enterprising young people, and they're Sabahans, but no companies bothered to look at what they did or didn't reward them sufficiently, and they are really hard workers. They will work day and night to not because of money, but because they're really committed to what they were doing, especially these chaps I saw as in Kinabalu coders. And these people are now actually the very crucial people who can actually make the economy turn around, who can make our state and our nation competitive with other nations, because of what has happened in the world. And these are the people that we should be looking for to develop our business and to strategize our operations, business operation. These are the people that we need to look for. The old traditional professions are also important, but they need to blend, and they need to source technologies in which they can improve the delivery of their services. These are the nerds of our society which have been neglected, but I think now they have to come to the forefront, and they can save our state and our nation. Okay, enough of that. The next point that we need to look at is in the flagship application. It's called e-business. Now, an e-business environment will be created in which MSC Malaysia companies will thrive and bolster economic growth by making full use of the MSC Malaysia infrastructure and multimedia application. The MSC Malaysia at that time can also be used as a regional hub for companies to supervise and deliver logistics and support to their branches through the region, whereby they can be linked at all times with MSC Malaysia low-cost and cutting-edge information nexus. Companies which will eventually have real-time operational control of the entire production process, from product development, manufacturing, and marketing to distribution. Some of this language is antiquated because the technology is developed as such as you don't really need a multimedia super corridor or even a Silicon Valley kind of place. Especially now with the pandemic, things and social distancing, the scenario has changed. Everybody has to work from home, and I can tell you that's a real challenge, because I started to work at home in the year 2003. I was looking at PDFs in the year 2003, and my whole entire office was converted to PDF in 2005. And when I used to talk about PDF, nobody knew what the hell I'm talking about. And then suddenly now there's a PDF explosion, and I structured my office that everybody works at home, and it takes like something like 20 years later, where people realize that working at home is essential, because if you can't work at home, that's the end of your business. And the last flagship operation, I got to finish fast because this video is taking a bit too long, is technopreneur development. In recognizing the need to further enhance MSC Malaysia's efforts to develop Malaysian SMEs, small and medium enterprises, in the ICT, There's the information and communication technology and multimedia industry, and other strategic high technology industries such as biotechnology and other life science. The government launched the Technopreneur Development Flagship TDF in November 2001. This initiative comes under the purview of the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, with the Multimedia Development Corporation acting as the implementing agency. The core objectives of the flagship are to facilitate the development of technopreneurs, startups and existing ICT companies, to catalyze and nurture a cluster of ICT SMEs, and to assist and facilitate the growth of ICT SMEs into world-class companies. Okay, I have been invited and been involved with organizations such as Magic, but a lot of these events of developing techno entrepreneurs is usually in Peninsular Malaysia. But down here, nobody kind of like. I mean the level of interest is very low. You can have you have maybe one or two good speakers, and then they come here and then they give a very nice talk. Everybody is very pumped up, and then after that, nothing happens. That's the usual scenario. And you go for these meetings and you get excited because you see this IT guy talking about B&B and stuff like that, and then after that, when he's gone, back to zero, because no companies in the Sabah context, no companies and no organizations are willing to fully finance and implement this kind of changes. So now we need a total about turn. Our Sabah economy needs a total about turn to seriously consider these developments in e-commerce, and that's the way forward. So thank you for listening. This is the opening video on technological, the history of the technology in our country, starting with the MSC Malaysia, and what happened there, and then in the next coming sessions we'll look at further developments, and then how the current e-commerce network based on law is operating in our country. Thank you and good night.